All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're looking at a truly fascinating book that proudly, and honestly pretty bravely, announces something highly unusual on its very first page. We're talking about the novel The Adequate Days by Max Claude. Now usually, when you crack open a new book, you're expecting an adventure, right? We've all been trained to expect the classic hero's journey, some profound conflict, or a massive life-altering revelation. But the source material we're unpacking today, it completely rejects all of that. Instead, it takes a magnifying glass to the absolute ordinary, and in doing so, it makes this incredibly compelling argument that a carefully constructed, completely normal daily routine is actually a masterpiece in its own right. Just look at how the opening pages instantly reject the idea that a story needs a massive plot twist to actually mean something. The authors flat out tell us, right out of the gate, nothing extraordinary will happen to Ho Dee in this novel. Ho Dee is our protagonist. She's a 43-year-old woman living in a mid-sized city, working a totally competent job, and living in an apartment that she has arranged exactly to her liking. And the authors are literally telling us to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because if you're just sitting there waiting for a dramatic turn, you're completely missing the point. The waiting itself is what's being examined here. It's a real mirror held up to us, asking, why on earth do we always believe the present moment is somehow withholding something from us? And this brilliantly illustrates the core argument of the book. The architecture of an ordinary life, lived with intention, is profound enough all on its own. Think about a traditional story model. You have a departure, you cross some difficult terrain, and eventually you arrive. It's entirely driven by plot. But the blueprint for The Adequate Days is totally different. It's not a plot, but it's not really some rebellious anti-plot either. It's simply rhythm. It's the rhythm of sitting in a room you know incredibly well, allowing yourself to genuinely see it, letting yourself return to that ordinary condition of not seeing, and then suddenly seeing it again. It's all about the absolute triumph of just being entirely here. So, to unpack this, we're going to explore these blueprints of a life well lived through 5 key areas. First, the anti-plot novel. Second, the architecture of routine. Third, sustained proximate presence. Fourth, the mechanics of holding. And finally, redefining the word adequate. Let's dive in. Section 1, the anti-plot novel. Engineer your presence. So let's take a closer look at our protagonist, Ho Dee. Her life functions precisely the way she's arranged it. For example, she wakes up consistently at 6:14 every single morning. That's exactly 1 minute before her alarm goes off. She doesn't find this annoying. She doesn't find it particularly satisfying. It's just simply one of the things that is true about being her. And this total lack of dramatic tension is exactly the point. Her life isn't supposed to be some grand metaphor for the modern woman or a heavy critique of domesticity. It's literally just her life, and it's functioning really well. We see this intentionality immediately in her mornings. For Ho Dee, making a 4-minute pour-over coffee isn't a chore. It's an engineered condition to be entirely present. I mean, sure, she could make coffee way faster, but she specifically chooses this method. She uses a specific grind, a thermometer, a slow spiral pour, because it forces her to give the process 4 uninterrupted minutes of her attention. The text is making a fascinating argument here. Presence isn't just some mystical state of enlightenment that randomly strikes you when you're sitting on a mountaintop. It's an environment you can actively build. If you arrange your life to include the conditions that make presence possible, you can literally engineer the feeling of being entirely here. Okay, moving on to Section 2, the architecture of routine. Scaling presence. Let's see how this engineered attention builds into the larger rhythm of her days and weeks. Because it's one thing to engineer presence in a micro-moment, like brewing coffee, right? But how does that scale up to an entire week or a whole year? The source material meticulously maps out her weekly structure, showing how these repeating points in time act as the true load-bearing walls of her existence. Check out these fixed points in her week. She has a Tuesday noon call with her best friend Britt. Wednesday evening is for writing a handwritten letter to her university friend Priya. Saturday morning is spent reading at a specific local cafe. And Sunday evening? That's for making a large batch of soup while chatting on the phone with her mother, Yvonne. These aren't chores for her. The author makes such a brilliant observation here. The richness of a Sunday evening doesn't come from it being some extraordinary, once-in-a-lifetime special occasion. The richness actually comes from the repetition. It's the cumulative weight of hundreds of identical Sunday evenings that makes this current one feel so substantial and thick. Now, even her frustrations are eventually redefined into structural advantages. Take her slow coworker Gerald. Ho Dee has a quarterly call with this county administrator, and Gerald requires 20 whole minutes of ambient, seemingly pointless conversation before he even touches the agenda. For years, she saw this as a massive, frustrating inefficiency. We've all been there, right? But through her engineered attention, she realizes she had it all wrong. Gerald time isn't actually slowness. You see, for Gerald, the destination of the conversation isn't the point. The conversation is the point. Those 20 minutes build a shared context so that when a decision finally needs to be made, it happens incredibly fast. It's just a completely different architecture of efficiency. And the real takeaway here is how a simple, conscious shift in your perspective can take a daily annoyance and turn it into a perfectly functioning system.
Let's look at Section 3, Sustained Proximate Presence, Coastline Knowledge. Here, we're going to explore how Ho Dee builds the architecture of her human connections, because the way she views her relationships completely challenges how society usually ranks our human interactions. She actually categorizes her relationships not by their supposed importance, but by type. She recognizes that you can know someone deeply just by observing their outline over many, many years. Think about the contrast between inside knowledge and coastline knowledge. Inside knowledge is what you share with your mother or your absolute best friend. It's got that deep history, that total, complete context. But coastline knowledge, that's what you share with the people you consistently see in your everyday routines. It's knowing someone the way you know a landscape, by looking at them for a really long time, without ever trying to possess them or dive into their deepest, darkest secrets. It is a genuine, beautiful category of human connection that, honestly, we rarely even have a word for in English. Her connection to Margot the barista perfectly proves that real relationships don't always require intense intimacy. Sometimes just repeatedly sharing space is enough to hold us. Over 8 years of Saturday mornings, Ho Dee and Margot have never spoken for more than 4 minutes at a time. And yet, Ho Dee knows the ages of Margot's children. She easily recognizes the tiny micro-adjustments Margot makes behind the counter to manage her chronic foot pain. They agree on totally mundane things, like the weather, but with genuine, unperformed sincerity. Ho Dee calls this sustained proximate presence. Think about that in your own life for a second. It asks absolutely nothing of either person, yet if Margot suddenly wasn't there one Saturday, Ho Dee would feel that loss deeply. It's such a profound reminder that we are held together not just by our inner circle, but by this quiet, repeating cast of characters in our everyday lives. Which brings us to Section 4, the mechanics of holding, invisible structures. This is really the emotional climax of our explainer. Ho Dee's connection with Martin, a retired civil engineer she meets at her Saturday cafe. They literally sit at adjacent tables for 4 years before they ever even exchange names. But when they finally do, it kicks off this quiet, incredibly deep exploration of how human beings actually survive. Martin starts sharing his structural drawings of bridges with Ho Dee. He uses suspension cables to philosophize about how these invisible systems hold our lives up. He shows her technical diagrams totally covered in his own handwritten philosophical notes. He points out that the cables of a massive suspension bridge don't actually know they're holding up the road, right? And the road certainly doesn't know it's being held. The holding doesn't require awareness to be completely 100% real. The relationship exists entirely in the structure itself. Then, looking at a masonry arch, they realize this is just a perfect metaphor for surviving grief. We hold each other simply by pressing against our neighbors. Martin explains that in a stone arch, there is no single most important stone. The whole thing works entirely through compression. Every stone presses against the one right next to it, transmitting the load all the way down into the earth. If you remove one element, the whole thing fails. And Ho Dee has this realization. This is exactly how families survive a sudden loss. When her father died, the remaining family didn't try to magically restore the old structure. They just redistributed the weight. They built a new arch entirely, holding each other up simply by pressing against one another. And then we learned something incredible. Martin's seemingly mundane Saturday cafe routine, it was actually a 7-year architectural project of rebuilding himself after the death of his wife. When Ho Dee asks him how long it took to find his own new configuration after his wife passed, he gives his heartbreakingly precise, almost mathematical answer. 4 years to stop falling, 3 more to find the shape that holds. Those 4 years of sitting silently at the cafe, not asking anyone's name, that was literally him falling. The next 3 years of just being present in the room, that was the finding. He didn't even realize he was doing it at the time. He thought he was just grabbing a coffee, but he was actually engineering his own survival. And that brings us to Section 5, redefining the word adequate, closing the gap. This leads us to the final, brilliant pivot of the source material. We finally hit the title of the book, and we discover that we have been fundamentally misunderstanding a completely common word.
The book beautifully reclaims this word. It transforms adequate from a term of boring compromise into the absolute triumph of building a life that perfectly fits. Normally, think about it. If someone tells you a meal or a movie was adequate, you assume it was like a C minus, right? It was barely acceptable. But Ho Dee redefines it. To be adequate means to contain exactly what is needed, no more, no less. It means you have inhabited your life so thoroughly and tailored your routines with such absolute precision that constantly chasing the extraordinary just becomes completely beside the point. The exhausting gap between where you are and where you thought you should be finally closes. And that, as the book tells us, is a remarkably restful place to live. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Instead of waiting around for some massive plot twist to finally give your life meaning, what if you just started engineering your own adequate days? Look at the load-bearing walls of your own week. Notice the people on your coastline. Stop asking if you are arriving at some grand mythical destination of happiness and start noticing whether your current hours are full. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. It's been an absolute pleasure diving into this architecture with you. Take a look around your own perfectly adequate rooms today, and I'll catch you next time.